Hi, I'm Ria. Welcome to It's the Audacity for Me, a personal development podcast that's a little different than most. This show is for anyone who's tired of the hustle mentality, but also recognizes that not everything is love and light. I'm here to help guide you to a more sustainable life that's in tune with nature, but also to help you see the light already inside of you. I can't wait to see you in this week's episode. Let's go. Hello and welcome back to It's the Audacity for Me. I am your host, Ria Davis, and I am so glad you're here today. Thanks for listening. On this week's episode, I'm talking to former Marine Corporal Kevin Marburger, also known as Ganga. I really believe in the interconnectedness of things, and this is no different. What began as a random connection on TikTok turned into an awesome podcast interview, and I'm really excited to share it with you today. Kevin is an amazing person with such an empathetic and encouraging spirit. During our time together, we had the opportunity to discuss so many different topics with so many really good lessons to learn and reflect on. His story is a great example of how a desire for community and a desire to do the right thing can sometimes be misguided. And through his journey from the Marines to Outlaw biker gang to white supremacy, he shares the common theme of fear and how learning to operate from a place of love is what made all the difference. Let's get into it. So it's so nice to meet you, Kevin. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and reaching out. You have an incredible story that I'm really excited to get into. So tell me a little bit more about just kind of where you are today and what you do and what really led you to reach out to me.
So today where I am would be I'm at a spot for the first time in life, I guess, where I'm genuinely happy and content, which is a pretty cool part of this journey of life. But today I get to give back and I get to help a lot of people. I get to help mostly veterans with addiction issues, which is really awesome. I'm a veteran myself as well as a recovering alcoholic myself. I get to help them and coach them with spiritual terms too, which is really pretty neat. Uh, what got me here is a lot of struggle and a lot of trial and error, I guess.
I love looking at it like that, trial and error, because I know a lot of people can kind of get stuck in the error part and not realize that there's more to it. We can keep working on it. So I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I always like to say is, people look at days very materialistically. They look at days as worth, but all days are the same. Really, what it comes down to, I think, is a matter of learning days and practice days. So practice days are days where it's kind of rough and I can practice what I've learned along this path of life to help myself and others. And then learning days are days where it's a little bit easier and I can kind of learn new tricks of the trade to be able to help other people. And when you look at it like that, you can kind of take the value or the preconceived notion of good and bad out and kind of inherently get all goodness, which is pretty cool.
Yes, I love that. That's one of my biggest things. I have a tattoo that really the main message is that there's no bad and good. We can learn from it, we can use it in some way, and there's always somewhere to go from there. So, speaking of tattoos, I have tons of questions for you about tattoos, but my main one is actually about a very specific tattoo that you have. In one of the interviews that I was watching that you have done, and I'm going to link all of those in the show notes so that way people can check those out too. It was a flaming mosque tattoo, and I wanted to ask you about that because of my tattoo, really, and we actually have a lot of things in common. We can talk about that in just a second. But for me, when I got my tattoo, it was a really not when I got it, but the inspiration for it. It was a really tough time in my life, and it has a lot of little details that really only I know the meaning of. But even though it was such a tough time, I wanted that tattoo to almost commemorate all of the growth that I have done since and just that time in my life. So that particular tattoo stood out to me because it really almost tells a story of a transformation that maybe at the time you didn't even know you were going to take. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I guess some background on that would be that did 6 years in the Marine Corps. Was combat wounded twice. Did a few deployments with them, and then medically retired in 2012. Um, After which, I decided one of the best routes for my life would be to seek white nationalist organizations, which we can talk about later, which is one of the darker points of my journey. But prior to that, that tattoo was put on me because during one of my deployments, we had a suicide bomber actually break through the line, through the wire into the base, and set himself on fire, blew himself up, and set himself on fire right by a propane tank. And caught the propane tank on one of the big home
Yeah.
industrial, caught that on fire. And then behind it was a picture of this mosque. Um, the mosque, and the picture of that really kind of stuck with me. The two kind of juxtapositions of this man that any of us really could be if we lived there and felt that way. But this man that decided to ultimately give his life up for what he thought was the correct moral thing. And then in the back of it, this building. And if you take the religion out of it and just make it a religious building,
Mhm.
it's this building that symbolizes freedom and happiness and growth and joy and compassion.
To so many people, I'm sure. Yeah.
Absolutely, and not just because it's a mosque, just a church,
Mhm.
you know. And to have the kind of two positions of that, where this man fanatically decided that the best way to ensue the procurement of that religion is through ultimately taking his own life and the life of others, versus this building in the background of it. It's kind of a safe haven and a place where hypothetically you aren't judged and you're always secure. It was really kind of a stark reminder of life. And at the time, I got it for very coarse feelings towards the people that we were fighting in the area in which we were deployed. But over time, it's kind of showed me the how you can view one thing from multiple angles over the course of your life, which is pretty neat.
And I actually, when I saw the tattoo, I paused it and was kind of taking a look because it it does have such a way that you can view it from so many angles, because in the tattoo, the mosque is so big and you've got the flames around it and you can almost see it as like a beacon of hope. And since you also happen to be from Maryland, I'm sure you know the story of the Star Spangled Banner and
Hmm.
and I almost kind of looked at it like that of, at the end of the day, after hearing your story, and we're going to get more into that, um, just how you always had a light inside, and there was all these external things, but then at the end of the day it was able to shine. And I just think that that is so powerful in and of itself, and reminded me so much of my own tattoo. And it also reminded me of somewhere that you may be familiar with. I know the majority of people listening to this will not be familiar with this place that I'm talking about. But where I grew up is so picturesque, in Maryland, right at the border of Maryland and Pennsylvania. And there's deer frolicking and like raccoons playing. I mean, it's gorgeous. And I went to this very teeny tiny little elementary school up right on the border, private school. And every year we had a letter that was sent home to our parents that they had to sign off that we could receive medication in case of a nuclear disaster. Because right up the road, there's a nuclear plant. And I'm sure you know
Yep.
exactly which one I'm talking about.
Yep.
And it's so funny that you have this beautiful, picturesque environment, but then there's something that could very well kill you at any moment. And it's kind of that difference of, well, what's bad and good? I mean, do we need the power? And it's this struggle of everyday life. And to kind of tie that into your story, a lot of what I've kind of gathered, or the things that have really stood out to me, was the idea of not only the bad versus good, but the us versus them mentality. So I know originally you were in the Marines and you left or started right out of high school. And you said that decision was prompted by 9/11. Can you tell
Yeah.
me more about that, and what kind of led to that decision?
Um, so 9/11 happened when I was in seventh grade. And one of my favorite teachers, favorite people in this world, his name he's still alive. I'll just call him Skip. His whole name doesn't matter, but he was a Navy captain during Vietnam that was in one of the first basic underwater demolition teams, which later became SEAL teams.
Okay.
Um, he was one of the first people that did the buzz programming during Vietnam, and he was an amazing gentleman. Crazy story, but anyways, 9/11 happened, and they came over the announcements and mentioned it, and told the teachers not to show us anything about it. And I remember Skip turned the TV on and said that we need to watch it because it's important, because it's history. And then he said something that really profoundly kind of changed my life. He said, the problem with Americans is today we're up in arms over it, and tomorrow we're not going to care about it. And I thought, man, that really is kind of true,
I heard that same thing when that happened. Everybody around me was saying that.
Yeah,
I remember that.
yeah. And I just the way, and it might have been because he is who he is, and the way he said it just really changed my life. And I came home to my parents and said I want to join the Marine Corps, and they kind of laughed at me. And I came down the next morning and said, hey, like, I'm going to join the Marine Corps. It's going to happen. Um, and that was a really pivotal moment in my life, was joining the Marine Corps.
So you
Uh,
said that your parents were surprised. So it wasn't something you didn't grow up in a military household kind of thing where this was something you'd always dreamed of or anything like that.
no, I think the idea always kind of fascinated me, the camaraderie, and whatnot. My dad's brothers were both in the military, but one was Navy and one was Marine Corps. So that's probably why I went Marine Corps. But most of it was just in that moment, it felt correct. It felt like it was the right thing to do. It felt like I was securing the lives for the people that I loved and the country that I loved. And one of my favorite sayings that I've found out throughout life, and it's on a T-shirt I have, but it says, "You can hate the war, but don't hate the warrior." I
Hmm.
always thought that was kind of neat, not getting political with stuff, but people can join for whatever reasons they have, and the wars can be fought for whatever reason they're fought for. But the idea that we can still love the individual who, in their eyes, is doing what they think is ultimately correct and very virtuous without condemning them for a country's decisions, I think is pretty neat. And it's really a universal thought, too. If I was born in Afghanistan in the 80s, there's a very good chance I would have went a different military
And
route.
on the other side, right?
And if I would have been born in Germany in the 30s, we could have known where I went, or Russia in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Um, but I think that idea really started opening my mind up to, like, hey, we're kind of all the same thing. Like, it's not good or bad. It's just different ways of viewing.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And I also want to add too with how we talked about or how you mentioned being, in Afghanistan, you could have been on the totally opposite side of this. And I think that applies to people on an individual level too. And we'll talk more about your tattoos and more kind of where you went after that. But somebody could very well look at you with the tattoos that you have and have a certain opinion. Um, and that doesn't make you a bad person, right? Because you've grown, you've developed, and things like that. But I think it's really easy to be in an us versus them world, or in that simplistic black and white idea, when you have this very pinholed view of someone, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
Exactly. So we shouldn't just, looking at people, and this kind of leads into sort of life after leaving the Marines, just realizing that not everybody boils down to that one little seed that you might see or not. So
Yeah, it's real easy to pinpoint people and to put them in a find one thing that we either like or dislike about them, because it's equally important. You can equally get roped in either way. It doesn't have to be just the disenfranchised that can fall victim. But It's definitely interesting to, and people still do it quite often with some of my tattoos. And I am in the process of getting them removed. Been granted a scholarship through one of the companies that did a documentary about me as well, which is just an awesome gift. But it is rather funny when people still say stuff about them. Like, you kind of just have to brush it off and think, I know I'm getting them off of me.
Well, and one of the things that you said in one of the interviews about it, someone had asked, "What would you say? How would you respond if someone brought it up?" And this was just such a great, like, universal truth that you said about, I might say something, I might not. It kind of depends on the situation, but I don't want to start something with someone because if they're showing me signs, like trying to be friends on this white supremacy thing, then they're probably not at the level that I am, spiritually evolving kind of thing. And I'm not trying to say that they're any less than or more than or anything like that. More so that their path just looks different. And the point they're on in their path is somewhere that you might have been, several years back. And so just you had said that sometimes it's just realizing that that was accepting karma. I mean, it's something that I did, and I have to understand that that's kind of how it works, and you're getting them removed. And the scholarship, I think that's all part of and ties into the karma of, hey, look, like, we're doing this thing. And I think that's awesome. Can you speak a little bit more to how you've come to this place of just peace and understanding that I can control me and that's it?
Yeah. So a lot of it usually is struggle. You know, struggle leads to growth. It's really hard to grow in comfortable times. It takes a lot of willpower, and for a lot of, I shouldn't speak for everybody, but for myself, I know my willpower came through growth. So luckily and unluckily, I guess it depends upon how you would view it or the time in which you would view it. I've had a lot of struggles in my life, which is great because that leads to a lot of growth. Um, so one of the big struggles would be, when I got out of the military right away, I got into a couple different organizations. I got into a one percenter motorcycle outlaw motorcycle club. The name or the club doesn't matter, but the principles do. You know, it's very much still an us versus them. You know, we live outside the laws, and we have to do this. Meanwhile, I've been in multiple clubs and organizations over the years. The outlaw clubs usually have by far the most stringent rules, which is hilarious because
Considering
we're
we're
supposed anti-law people with the most laws, you know. But that's usually how it
here's the
is.
handbook. Yes.
Usually, it's too convoluted to kind of see our own ignorance in the situation. But and the other thing I got into then was whatever you want to call it, neo-Nazi white power, skinhead, white nationalism movement. And that was very easy for me to fall right into, and it was very easy for them to prey upon me as well. I was very disenfranchised from what I saw and witnessed in the war, um, as most of us were, and a lot of us turned to alcohol or drugs or women or lifestyles, which we can expound upon later too. But for me, I went right back into what I knew was comfortable. And what I knew was comfortable was other men because I was infantry and it's male only, and us versus them. You know, um,
And you kind of found that camaraderie within the skin color almost. It was an easy kind of transition or transfer of that mentality.
correct. And the easiest way, I guess, to describe it for most people, because most people never can understand it, can never quantify it, can never rectify doing it in their minds, which is great because in no way, shape, or circumstance should we.
Mhm.
But for those of us that cannot understand why somebody could align themselves with such views, it can very easily say, I aligned myself with the views of the Marine Corps based off a geographic area in which I found myself residing.
And that makes sense. And I think that's how, in a larger sense, that's how a lot of people end up in situations that they do. Growing up where I did, very close to, I won't name specific counties or anything, but there's a bridge that takes you over a river at the very tip of Maryland, and you go from my hometown to or my home county to another one, and in that county there are some very specific areas that you might not want to go to if you are not white. And I hate that, but I grew up with that sort of just being normal. Like, that's just, if you're dating somebody that's a different color, you might not want to go on a date there after dark, kind of thing. And I know you mentioned in another interview about during that time when you join, at first, like we were talking about the laws, at first they were really strict, and then kind of started letting other people join that were of a different ethnicity. And then you also mentioned going down into Baltimore, and if you saw like an interracial couple or something like that, that was not a good thing. So could you expand a little more on that?
Yeah, a lot of gather my thoughts. So I guess anybody that is insecure within themselves projects those insecurities upon other people, and that is a rather universally applied tactic. Um, those of us that are extreme use it to extremes. So, when we were with the skinheads, anytime we'd see an interracial couple, it would be cause for heckling or harassment of the sort. So what we would do then is frequent places where we knew we would find that,
So kind
you know,
of looking for trouble, so to speak.
correct. It's also much easier to institutionalize somebody when the institutionalized views are really prevalent and readily available. So instead of having us go to a farm in Kentucky, let's say,
Yes.
um,
Or the middle of nowhere in Georgia.
correct,
Mhm.
let's go down to Northeast Baltimore. And all we are going to find is what we don't want to find, or what will entice those that we want to be enticed to follow our views because it's all prevalently in front of us now.
Yes.
So in a very twisted way, we used to use that for the betterment of our own means, which was recruitment or pulling people in, or somebody was on the verge of going out of the club. We'd say, look at all this, whatever you want to find, there's a way for it.
And
Uh,
that's true across the board. If you want to prove a point, there's a way to do it. And really quickly, I want to go back just a second, because earlier you had mentioned it might be hard for the average person to just see, how do you end up in this type of situation with this mindset? But in reality, listening to you describe it, I can connect several different organizations. And I'll use evangelical Christianity as an example, but I just want to preface with that is not the only example. That is just one that stands out in my mind. Um, and the extreme ends of it. A lot of times you see, people purposely showing those types of situations. Look at all this sin in the world. Look at this, look at that. But when you take a step back and you take the blinders off, you realize really the LGBTQ community is not assaulting people at every turn. I mean, it's just not, statistics are not there to support that. There's no,
correct.
so things like that, I can see how very easily it can lead you down different paths, whether that be, neo-Nazi situation, Christianity, any path that someone wants to lead you down. It's possible with the right information. um, and I wanted to ask you too, I had a little list of questions here I wanted to make sure I asked. Nowadays there are a lot of people talking about the correlation between social media and just sort of this pipeline to white supremacy. But back when we were kids, that wasn't a thing. So, how would you say that? What are your thoughts on that? Kind of comparing it to how I guess they did things back in our day. I don't know if that's like old school or back in the day, if you could call that yet. I hope not. But back then we didn't have social media. And like with 9/11, we saw it on TV, but there weren't people immediately reacting to it. So could you, I know in the Marine Corps specifically, but do you think that you could pinpoint a time where that switch happened? And kind of what are your thoughts on how it happens today?
Just for me specifically, I would say that it's really hard to pinpoint down an exact moment where I felt overwhelmingly that way. I would say with the way the Marine Corps or the military treat you, especially during a time of war. Let me preface it with that. Peacetime Marine Corps and wartime Marine Corps are very much different animals, as they should be. Uh, Wartime Marine Corps very much has to be an us versus them mentality, almost just because of the nature of the
Of
war.
yeah.
Um, and I've heard the social media thing before, and I've really kind of thought a lot about it. And I will say I've done not much research into it, but in my mind, I think what it is, I think that saying that it's an easier route for those that want to go a certain way makes sense, but I also think that it's kind of scapegoating the real issue.
Mhm.
Um, and the real issue would be systematical oppression and racism within our country. I would say that social media makes it easier to find that stuff, but to play devil's advocate, it also makes it easier to find the stuff that says that stuff's horrible,
Yes,
right? Like when we were growing up, all that we had was books at the library, perhaps, but in home resources would have been the TV and the newspaper.
exactly.
So, whatever those two places were reporting was our truth. Now, there's a lot more truth out there, but there's also a lot more
Digging stuff to
convolutedness.
do. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I think it